Sarah Martinez had been working construction for 8 years, but she never thought she would end up patching bullet holes in a military shooting range at dawn on a Tuesday morning. The concrete wall looked like it had been through a war zone, which, in a way, it had. Hundreds of rounds had chipped away at the reinforced barrier over the months, leaving spiderweb cracks and deep gouges that needed immediate attention. She adjusted her hard hat and picked up her trowel, mixing the quick-set concrete with practiced movements. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of gunpowder that seemed permanently embedded in everything at the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility. Sarah had won the contract to repair the range walls through her small construction company, beating out 3 larger firms with her competitive bid and reputation for quality work. The facility was mostly quiet at this early hour. Most training exercises happened later in the day, giving her a peaceful window to work without the constant crack of rifle fire. She had learned to time her repairs around the SEAL team schedules, something that had taken weeks to figure out when she first started the job. As she smoothed concrete into a particularly deep hole, Sarah heard footsteps approaching behind her. She glanced over her shoulder to see a tall man in military fatigues walking toward her section of the wall. His walk had that distinctive, confident stride she had learned to recognize among the Special Forces personnel who trained here. "Morning," he called out, his voice carrying a slight southern drawl. "You're the contractor fixing our wall?" Sarah turned around fully, wiping her hands on a rag. The man looked to be in his early 30s, with short brown hair and the kind of weathered face that came from years of outdoor operations. His uniform bore the insignia she had learned belonged to the Navy SEALs. "That's me," she replied with a smile. "Sarah Martinez. I've been working on these walls for about 3 months now. You guys really put them through their paces." The SEAL chuckled and extended his hand. "Lieutenant Commander Jake Thompson. Yeah, we tend to be hard on the infrastructure around here. Always appreciate good repair work, though." They shook hands, and Sarah noticed the firm grip that spoke of serious physical training. She had worked around military personnel before, but the SEALs had a different presence entirely. There was something about their calm confidence that stood out even among other special forces. "What brings you out here so early?" Sarah asked, returning to her work, but keeping the conversation going. She had found that being friendly with the personnel made her job much easier, and often led to helpful information about upcoming training schedules. Jake moved closer to examine her work, watching as she skillfully filled in the damaged areas. "Actually, I was hoping to catch you. We've been having some issues with one section of the wall over on Range 3. The repairs from last month are already showing stress fractures." Sarah paused in her work, frowning. She took pride in her craftsmanship, and the idea that her previous work was failing bothered her. "Stress fractures? That shouldn't be happening with the grade of concrete I used. Mind if I take a look?" "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say," Jake replied. "Follow me." They walked together across the facility, passing other ranges and training areas. Sarah carried her tool bag, curious about what might have gone wrong with her previous repair work. The morning sun was getting higher, casting long shadows across the complex. Range 3 was set up differently from the others. Instead of the standard target practice configuration, this range had been modified for what appeared to be precision shooting exercises. The targets were positioned at various distances, some as far as 800 yards away. Jake led her to the far end of the range where the wall showed clear signs of recent damage. Sarah knelt down to examine the concrete more closely, running her fingers along the cracks that had formed in her previous repair. "This is strange," she murmured, pulling out a small flashlight to get a better look. "These cracks aren't from normal wear. Something else caused this." Jake knelt down beside her, pointing to specific areas of damage. "That's what we thought too. We've been having some accuracy issues with long-range shots. Some of our best marksmen have been consistently missing targets they should hit easily." Sarah stood up and looked out across the range, then back at the wall. A thought began forming in her mind. "What kind of rounds are you using for the long-distance shooting?" "Standard, 308 match-grade ammunition. Same stuff we always use for precision training." She walked along the wall, examining other areas that hadn't been recently repaired. The pattern of damage was telling a story. But it wasn't the story she had expected. "Lieutenant Commander, I think your accuracy problem might not be with your marksman." Jake raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Jake, look at this," Sarah said, pointing to various impact points on the wall. "The bullet strikes aren't where they should be if your guys were missing their targets. They're hitting in a pattern that suggests the rounds are deflecting." She moved to a section of the original wall that hadn't needed repair and ran her hand along the surface. "Feel this. You notice how this section is slightly different in texture?" Jake placed his palm against the wall where she indicated. The concrete felt rougher, with a slightly different grain structure. "Yeah, I can feel the difference." "What does that mean?" "It means whoever built this range originally used a different concrete mix in different sections. Some areas have more aggregate, some have different additives. When a high-velocity round hits certain sections, it's not absorbing the impact the same way." Sarah pulled out her phone and started taking photos of the wall sections, documenting the differences in the concrete composition. "I think some of your long-range shots are hitting micro-variations in the wall surface and deflecting just enough to throw off the trajectory calculations for subsequent rounds." Jake stood up and looked at her with new respect. "You figured that out just by looking at the wall?" 8 years of construction work teaches you to read concrete like a book," Sarah replied with a grin. "Plus, I've always been interested in ballistics. My dad was a police marksman before he went into construction. I grew up around shooting ranges." "Well, that explains why you bid on this particular job," Jake said. "Most contractors wouldn't want to deal with a military shooting facility." Sarah laughed. "Most contractors haven't spent their childhood weekends helping their dad maintain police training ranges. This stuff fascinates me." Jake was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking about something. Then he looked at her with an expression that seemed to be weighing a decision. "Sarah, can I ask you something? Have you ever done any precision shooting yourself?" The question caught her off guard. "Some. My dad taught me the basics when I was younger, and I've kept up with it over the years." "Why?" Jake looked out across the range, then back at her. "We've got a theory about what's causing our accuracy issues. But we need someone with a fresh perspective to test it. Someone who understands both the construction side and has shooting experience." Sarah felt her pulse quicken slightly. The tone in his voice suggested this was more than just casual curiosity. "What kind of test?" "The kind where I hand you my rifle and see if you can help us figure out exactly what's happening with these deflections," Jake said, his expression serious. "You interested in helping us solve this puzzle?" Sarah stared at Jake for a long moment, processing what he had just asked. The morning sun had climbed higher, and she could hear the distant sounds of the base coming to life. Other personnel would be arriving soon for their training exercises. "You want me to shoot your rifle to test a theory about wall deflections?" she asked, wanting to make sure she understood correctly. Jake nodded. "We've had our best marksmen try to identify the problem, but they all have years of training that makes them automatically adjust for environmental factors. We need someone with shooting skills but without the ingrained compensations. Someone who can give us objective feedback about what the rifle is actually doing." Sarah looked out across the range. The furthest targets were barely visible, small dots in the distance that would require exceptional accuracy to hit. "What exactly do you think is happening?" "We believe that when rounds hit certain sections of the wall, they're creating micro-vibrations that travel through the concrete structure. These vibrations might be affecting subsequent shots by creating tiny movements in the shooting platform, or even affecting the acoustics in ways that throw off our marksman's timing." Sarah knelt down again and pressed her ear to the wall, then tapped it lightly with her knuckles in several places. The sound varied noticeably between sections. "That's actually brilliant thinking. Different concrete densities would definitely transmit vibrations differently." Jake watched her work, clearly impressed by her methodical approach. "So you understand why we need someone who can shoot accurately but won't unconsciously compensate for problems we're trying to identify?" "I understand the theory," Sarah said, standing up and brushing dirt off her knees. "But are you sure about this? I mean, I'm just a contractor. Shouldn't this kind of testing be done by your people?" "Normally, yes," Jake replied. "But this isn't a normal situation. We've been trying to solve this problem for weeks using conventional approaches. Sometimes you need an outsider's perspective. Sarah looked at her tool bag, then back at Jake. The logical part of her mind said this was outside her job description, and possibly inappropriate. But the part of her that had grown up around shooting ranges and had always been curious about ballistics was intrigued by the puzzle. "What kind of rifle are we talking about?" she asked. Jake smiled, recognizing her interest. M40. A 5 sniper rifle. 308 caliber. Precision built for long-range accuracy. It's the same type our marksmen have been using for the tests that identified the problem. And you think I can help identify something your trained snipers missed? I think you can give us data they can't, Jake said. They're too good. They automatically adjust for problems without even realizing it. We need someone who will experience the full effect of whatever's causing the accuracy issues. Sarah considered this for a moment. It made sense from a scientific standpoint. If the SEALs were unconsciously compensating for environmental factors, they might not even be aware they were doing it. "All right," she said finally. "I'll help with your test. But I want to understand the safety protocols first. And I want to know exactly what data you're trying to collect." Jake's expression became more serious. "Absolutely. Safety is paramount. We'll set up the same way we do for precision training exercises. Full safety equipment, range officers, controlled environment. As for data, we want to track shot groupings, any environmental factors you notice, and your subjective experience of the rifle's behavior." They walked back toward the main facility to gather the necessary equipment. Jake explained the testing protocol as they went, describing how they would set up targets at various distances and have Sarah shoot from different positions along the firing line. "The key thing," he said, "is that you don't try to compensate for anything unusual you might notice. If the rifle feels like it's pulling to one side, or if you hear strange acoustics, just make note of it but don't adjust your shooting technique." 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself lying prone on a shooting mat, wearing safety glasses and ear protection. The M40A5 rifle felt solid in her hands, heavier than the sporting rifles she was used to but well balanced. Jake knelt beside her, serving as both instructor and observer. "The target is at 400 yards, he said, pointing downrange. "Standard bullseye. Just like you'd find at any civilian range. Take your time, get comfortable with the rifle, and fire when ready." Sarah settled into the shooting position, adjusting her grip and sight picture. The scope was of much higher quality than anything she had used before, bringing the distant target into crystal clear focus. She controlled her breathing, found her natural respiratory pause, and gently squeezed the trigger. The rifle fired with a sharp crack, and she felt the familiar push of recoil against her shoulder. Through the scope, she could see that the shot had hit slightly left of center, which was better than she had expected for her first shot with an unfamiliar rifle. "Good shot," Jake said, lowering his binoculars. "How did the rifle feel?" "Smooth," Sarah replied, working the bolt to chamber another round. Maybe a tiny bit of vibration through the stock, but nothing unusual. "Noted. Try the next shot from about 10 feet to your left." Sarah gathered up the rifle and moved to the new position. This area of the firing line was directly in front of one of the concrete sections she had repaired the previous month. She settled into position and aimed at the same target. This time, something felt different. As she settled into her shooting stance, she could sense a subtle vibration coming up through the ground. It was so faint she almost dismissed it, but Jake had specifically asked her to note anything unusual. "There's a vibration here," she said, not lifting her eye from the scope. "It's very subtle. Like there's machinery running somewhere nearby." Jake made a note on his clipboard. "We're not running any machinery right now. Fire when ready." Sarah took the shot and immediately noticed the difference. The rifle seemed to move slightly just as she fired, causing the shot to impact noticeably lower and to the right compared to her first shot. "That was strange," she said, sitting up and looking at Jake. "The rifle definitely moved differently on that shot." "Describe it." "It felt like there was a tiny tremor that ran through the shooting platform just as I fired. Almost like a small earthquake, but much more subtle." Jake's eyes lit up. That's exactly what we were hoping to document. Can you try one more shot from the same position? Sarah repositioned herself and aimed again. This time, she focused specifically on feeling for any unusual sensations. Sure enough, just as she was preparing to fire, she felt the faint vibration again. It seemed to come in waves, lasting for a few seconds at a time. She fired, and once again, the shot hit lower and right of her intended point of aim. It's definitely not random, she said, setting the rifle down safely. There's a pattern to the vibration. It builds up, peaks, then fades away. The timing seems to be related to the concrete structure itself. Jake was writing rapidly on his clipboard. This is incredibly valuable data. Our marksmen never reported feeling vibrations, but they might be so used to compensating for minor environmental factors that they don't consciously notice them anymore. Sarah stood up and walked to the concrete wall, placing her hand against the surface. I think the problem might be more complex than just vibrations from impacts, she said slowly. What do you mean? Feel this, she said, motioning for Jake to put his hand on the wall. Now pay attention to what happens. She walked about 20 feet away and stomped her foot hard against the ground. Jake's eyes widened as he felt a subtle wave travel through the concrete structure. The whole wall is acting like a giant tuning fork, Sarah said, returning to where he stood. When rounds impact one section, they create vibrations that travel through the entire structure. But different sections of concrete transmit those vibrations at different speeds and amplitudes. Jake removed his hand from the wall, looking thoughtful. So, shots fired at one position could be affecting the accuracy of shots fired from completely different positions, even minutes later? Exactly. And if your marksmen have been practicing here regularly, the concrete has probably been accumulating microstresses that are changing how it responds to impacts. Sarah pulled out her phone and opened a voice recording app. Here, let me show you something else. She walked to different sections of the wall and tapped each one with a metal tool from her kit. The sounds were clearly different, ranging from sharp, high-pitched rings to dull, muffled thuds. Each section is resonating at a different frequency, she explained. When you're firing multiple rounds in sequence, you're essentially playing the wall like a complex musical instrument. The vibrations from each shot interact with the vibrations already present in the structure. Jake stared at the wall with new understanding. No wonder our precision training has been inconsistent. We've been dealing with an environment that changes dynamically based on our own shooting activity. Sarah nodded. And the repairs I've been doing have probably made the problem worse by introducing new sections of concrete with different acoustic properties. So what do we do about it? Sarah looked along the length of the wall, her mind already working on potential solutions. Well, that depends on how much you want to spend and how important consistency is to your training program. There are several approaches we could take. Jake looked at Sarah expectantly, clearly eager to hear her proposed solutions. The morning was warming up, and they could hear vehicles arriving as more personnel reported for duty. Soon, the ranges would be busy with training activities. The first option is the expensive one, Sarah began, walking along the wall and pointing to different sections. We could tear down the entire wall and rebuild it with uniform concrete specifications, same aggregate, same additives, same curing conditions throughout. That would eliminate the acoustic inconsistencies. And the second option? We work with what we have and turn the acoustic properties into an advantage rather than a problem. Sarah pulled out her measuring tape and began taking notes. If we can map the resonant frequencies of each section, we could potentially predict and compensate for the vibrations. Jake watched her work with growing respect. Explain that approach. Think of it like tuning a piano, Sarah said, tapping different sections of the wall systematically. Each section of this wall has its own resonant frequency. Instead of trying to eliminate those frequencies, we map them precisely. Then we can predict how shots fired from different positions will interact with the wall's acoustic response. She pulled out her phone again and opened a sound analysis app she used for construction work. With this app, I can measure the exact frequency response of each section. We create an acoustic map of the entire range. And then what? Then your marksmen can use that information to improve their accuracy instead of fighting against it. They would know that firing from position A will create vibrations that peak 3 seconds later, or that position B has a natural dampening effect that actually improves stability. Jake was quiet for a moment, processing this idea. You're suggesting we turn an environmental problem into tactical intelligence. Exactly. Elite marksmen already account for wind, temperature, humidity, and dozens of other environmental factors. This would just be one more variable to master. Sarah continued her measurements, documenting the acoustic signature of each section. As she worked, she noticed Jake watching her technique with interest. "You know," he said after a while, "you approach problems differently than most people we work with." "How so?" "Most contractors see a problem and immediately want to fix it by replacing or rebuilding. You're looking for ways to work with the existing conditions and find advantages in what others see as flaws." Sarah smiled. "That's what happens when you grow up in a family of problem solvers. My dad always said that the most elegant solutions usually involve understanding the problem better, rather than just throwing resources at it." As if summoned by her mention of problem solving, Jake's radio crackled to life. "Lieutenant Commander Thompson, please report to Building C for briefing prep." Jake responded to the call, then turned back to Sarah. "I need to go, but I'd like to continue this conversation. Would you be willing to prepare a formal proposal for the acoustic mapping approach?" "Absolutely. Give me a week to do proper measurements and research. I'll put together a comprehensive plan." "Outstanding. And Sarah?" Jake paused, his expression serious. "What you figured out this morning probably would have taken our technical team months to identify. You solved in 2 hours what we've been struggling with for weeks." Sarah felt a warm sense of satisfaction. "Just doing my job?" "Well, maybe a little more than my job. Definitely more than your job. We'll make sure the contract reflects the additional scope of work." They shook hands again, and Sarah watched Jake walk away toward the main building. She turned back to the wall, looking at it with new eyes. What had started as a simple repair job had turned into something much more interesting. Over the next week, Sarah threw herself into the acoustic analysis project. She borrowed specialized equipment from a friend who worked in architectural acoustics and spent long hours at the range, documenting the frequency response of every section of concrete. She discovered that the wall's acoustic properties were even more complex than she had initially suspected. The original construction had been done in phases over several months, with different crews and slightly different concrete mixes for each phase. Weather conditions during curing had also varied, creating subtle but measurable differences in density and porosity. The result was a structure that acted like a complex musical instrument, with each section contributing to an overall harmonic signature. When Jake returned from a training exercise later that week, Sarah was ready with her findings. She had prepared detailed charts showing the resonant frequencies, dampening coefficients, and vibration transmission patterns for the entire range complex. "This is incredible," Jake said, studying her documentation. "You've essentially created acoustic fingerprint for the entire facility." "It gets better," Sarah said, pulling out her laptop. "I've also developed a prediction model based on the shooting position, ammunition type, and firing sequence. We can predict how the wall vibrations will affect accuracy." She showed him computer simulations that illustrated how sound waves traveled through the concrete structure and interfered with each other. The visual representation made it clear why some shooting positions produced consistent accuracy, while others had seemed random. "We tested your predictions yesterday," Jake said with a grin. "Sergeant Martinez used your acoustic map to plan his shooting sequence, and his scores improved by 15%. Seriously? Seriously. Instead of fighting against the environmental factors, he worked with them. He even found positions where the wall vibrations actually enhanced stability by creating a natural dampening effect." Sarah felt a surge of pride. Her unconventional approach had not only solved the problem but had actually improved the training effectiveness of one of the most elite military units in the world. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now we implement your system range-wide. The training command wants to adopt your acoustic mapping technique as a standard protocol for all precision shooting facilities." Sarah stared at him in amazement. All of them? All of them. You've essentially invented a new field of applied acoustics for military marksmanship. The technical documentation you've prepared is going to become required reading for range design and sniper training programs. 6 months later, Sarah was standing in front of a conference room full of military engineers and marksmanship instructors, explaining her acoustic mapping methodology. What had started as a simple wall repair job had evolved into a new career specialty. Her company now held contracts at military facilities across 3 states, conducting acoustic analysis and optimization for shooting ranges. She had hired 2 additional engineers and was working on her first patent application. But perhaps the most satisfying part was a letter she received from Sergeant Martinez, the marksman who had first tested her predictions. His team had used her acoustic mapping techniques during an international marksmanship competition and had set a new record for precision shooting accuracy. The letter concluded with a simple line that made Sarah smile every time she read it. "Thanks for teaching us that sometimes the best way to hit your target is to listen to the wall first." Looking back, Sarah often marveled at how a routine Tuesday morning repair job had changed the entire trajectory of her career. She had simply been patching holes in a wall when a Navy SEAL handed her his rifle and asked her to solve a puzzle. That moment of trust and collaboration had opened up possibilities she never could have imagined. The shooting range still bore the scars of countless training exercises, but now those scars told a story of innovation and problem-solving. Each repaired section was carefully documented in Sarah's acoustic database, contributing to an ever-growing understanding of how concrete structures interact with the demands of precision marksmanship. And every time she returned to that original range for maintenance work, Sarah remembered the morning when Lieutenant Commander Jake Thompson stepped back and asked her to listen to what the wall was trying to tell them. It had been the beginning of an entirely new way of understanding the relationship between architecture and accuracy, between construction and combat effectiveness. The wall had indeed been trying to tell them something. They just needed the right person to translate its message.